People are going to oppose us, they're going to persecute us, and some of us will be killed. Well, talk about the proverbial pin drop. In El Salvador, we had especially our Jesuit martyrs, and the 6 priests, remember, who was slain, and the head of them was a wonderful man named Ignacio Ellacuría, and a solid Basque who spoke very openly. And remember, they thought that they had shot them through the head and spilled their brains to show that this was an attack on the intellectual life and capacity of the country. That this is what they were going. That university represented the only active voice to a terrible government and a terrible group that was running the country.
In leading the Jesuits to engage a changing world, Arrupe attracts international attention. It is not just Latin America that he has to contend with. Jesuits in Asia struggle anew with acculturation. In the United States, Jesuit Dan Berrigan is confronting public policies. Robert Drinan is an elected congressman to the great displeasure of conservative opponents. John McNeil is fueling culture wars with his book, The Church and the Homosexual. All of this is a source of inner turmoil for Arrupe as he attempts to discern the movement of the Holy Spirit in the change and conflict he is constantly called upon to mediate, including Vatican pressures to clamp down on what the Vatican saw as dissent. The policies of the general congregations that elected Pedro Arrupe in 1965 and later validated and advanced those policies in 1975 were still not well received by some Jesuits, some of whom had the ear of powerful cardinals in the Holy See. Relationships with the Vatican become increasingly complicated. Arrupe is unwaveringly loyal to the papacy, but he is crushed to learn that some Jesuits critical of him are finding favor in the corridors of the Vatican. Pope Paul VI, attempting a balancing act of his own in the wake of Vatican II, is someone Arrupe can talk with. But when John Paul II is elected in 1978, the relationship with the Vatican changes. By this time, a weary Arrupe believes that after almost 15 tumultuous years in office, it is time for new Jesuit leadership. He resolves to resign, and after consulting with his general assistants, determines to notify the Pope.
When Father Arrupe wanted to resign, he couldn't get the Pope to receive him. And when he finally did get an audience, it was really jammed in between 2 other audiences, so it lasted all of 13 minutes. And when Arrupe saw the Pope, he's always so deferential. He said, and when he mentioned design, the Pope's order, and the Pope said, where do I come into this? Well, it was rather blunt. And Arrupe was surprised. So he said, well, you're the superior. And then they went a little further, and he was looking at the memorandum, the Pope, and then he said to Arrupe, suppose I say no. Well, Arrupe said, well, what can I do? You're the superior. So at that point, the aides had come and they pulled him away. That was the end of the meeting. I think, the Pope, he didn't know what the results of his resignation would be, and he never wanted to deal with the unknown. So you didn't know who would be elected, so you couldn't tell what the outcome was going to be. And this Pope didn't want to go into anything where he could not already foresee the result. And whereas the Pope, John Paul II, had agreed to meet with Father Arrupe, to dialogue with him, and solve the problems around Father Arrupe's proposal to resign, the Pope simply wouldn't receive him in audience. That went on about 10 months. And when the Pope did see him, he said to Arrupe, this has been a good conversation, Father General, and I want to continue this with you. And Arrupe said, oh, I'd be delighted. Please, anything you want to know, call on me. Instead of calling on these other people, he was calling on other Jesuits, for example. Well, next month, May 13, that was the day of the assassination, so the Pope could no longer dialogue with Arrupe.
It would be months before the Pope recovers from the assassination attempt.
That was May of 1981. And then August of 1981, Arrupe was returning to Rome from a long trip that was especially to the Philippines. It was a long flight, and when they arrived in Rome at the airport, they noticed Arrupe was flushed, he was perspiring tremendously, and his language wasn't making much sense. So they rushed him into the car and rushed him right to the hospital named Salvator Mundi in Rome, where they had all of Arrupe's records. They saw right away it was a stroke. He had been able to speak. He was fluent in 7 languages. That disappeared. He understood the languages, but he couldn't speak them. All he could speak was a form of Spanish that was very difficult to understand, even for native Spanish speakers. So that stroke was a severe stroke. It really incapacitated him. We got out word to the whole society by cable, said he'd had this stroke. We didn't know the extent of it at the time, but as it turned out, he was no longer able to go on.
With Arrupe struck down, the governance of the society falls to his Vicar General, Father P.Vincent O'Keefe, which assures the continuity of Arrupe's vision and the election of a successor. This is not what Pope John Paul II has in mind, however. He does not want to risk a general congregation with the unknowns that implies. Within a few months, he appoints his own personal representative to assume leadership, Father Paolo Dezza. This direct intervention by the Pope in the governance of the Society of Jesus causes great consternation among Jesuits. They could not